Smoke tastes like copper and burnt plastic. Gillian lay pinned beneath a collapsed roof beam, listening to the men who put her there laugh as they walked away. They thought the fire would finish the job. They forgot what she did for a living. Heat doesn't just burn, it suffocates. It presses the oxygen out of your lungs and replaces it with a thick, choking weight. Gillian opened her left eye. The right was swollen shut, glued together by dried blood and soot. Flames licked the drywall 2 feet from her face, peeling the cheap floral wallpaper into curling, blackened husks. The acrid stench of melting polymer filled her nostrils as her tactical vest began to fuse with her uniform. She tried to inhale. A wet, rattling cough tore up her throat. She tasted ash and the metallic tang of her own busted lip. Her brain ran a sluggish, involuntary diagnostic. Left arm, responsive, though the fabric of her shirt was melted to the forearm. Torso, bruised, sharp pains radiating from her ribs. A parting gift from Boyd's combat boot. Right leg, trapped. She looked down through the haze. A ceiling joist, heavy with plaster and splintered wood, lay across her thigh. The fire was eating its way along the timber, inching toward her knee. The crackle of the flames was deafening, drowning out the high-pitched ringing in her ears. There was no surge of adrenaline. There was no righteous fury, no cinematic flashback to her SEAL qualification training, no silent vow of vengeance. There was only panic, primal, ugly, rat-in-a-trap panic. She thrashed. She clawed at the floorboards, her fingernails tearing and bleeding against the exposed nails. She screamed, a ragged, pathetic sound that was swallowed entirely by the roar of the inferno. Calm down. The thought wasn't a command. It was a desperate plea from the logical fraction of her brain that hadn't yet succumbed to the pain. Just calm down. The heat was blistering her cheek. She could smell burning meat. It took a detached, horrifying second to realize it was her own thigh, where the smoldering beam rested against her pants. Gillian grabbed the beam with both hands. The wood was searing hot. The skin on her palms hissed, instantly blistering. She didn't let go. She pushed. Her muscles cramped, screaming in protest. The beam didn't move. The fire roared louder, the air vibrating with the pressure of the heat. She closed her remaining eye, ground her teeth together until her jaw popped, and shoved again, leveraging her uninjured leg against the floorboards. A groan of shifting weight, a sliver of space. She dragged her trapped leg backward. Torn muscle scraped against the jagged splinters of the floor. The localized agony was so intense, her vision whited out, her brain shutting off the optical feed to process the pain. She was free, but she wasn't out. The safe house was a collapsing cage. The front door was blocked by a wall of orange flame. The window to her left was shattered, framing a square of cool, dark night. She dragged herself toward it, a crippled insect hauling a useless limb. Her elbows dug into the floor, pulling her dead weight inch by inch. She hauled herself over the sill, catching her belt on jagged glass, and fell. It was only a 3-foot drop, but it felt like falling off a building. She hit the frozen mud outside and lay there. The freezing rain immediately hit her burns. The temperature drop was a violent shock to her system. She curled into a fetal position, shaking uncontrollably, and vomited bile into the dead grass. 10 yards away, the heavy engine of Boyd's SUV turned over. She heard the tires spin in the mud, then catch. The taillights faded down the logging road, washing the bare tree trunks in flashes of red. Command had told her this was a low-visibility recon, simple overwatch for a DEA liaison. They didn't mention the 4 highly trained private contractors, waiting in the dark with suppressed rifles and a thermite charge. They didn't check to see if she was dead. They were mercenaries: Boyd, Russo, Davies, Miller. They got the drives, shot her in the plate carrier, kicked her down, and tossed the incendiary into the corner. Simple, clean, sloppy. Gillian rolled onto her back. The rain felt like needles on her raw face. She reached to her chest. The ceramic plate had stopped Russo's rounds, but the blunt force had bruised her sternum so badly, every breath felt like inhaling glass. She patted her hip. Sidearm gone. Combat knife gone. She turned her head. Beside a rusted-out tractor tire, half submerged in a puddle of muddy water, lay her rifle. It was a heavily modified Mark 13. Russo had picked it up, scoffed at the weight of the long barrel, and tossed it out the window before they torched the place. It was just a heavy, cumbersome piece of metal to them. They were close-quarters guys, smash and grab. Room clearers. They didn't appreciate the patience of a long gun. Gillian dragged herself to the puddle. Her raw hands slipped on the mud. She pulled the rifle from the muck. The action was gritty, covered in dirt, but the bolt cleared when she racked it. The optic, a heavy tactical scope, was coated in slime, but the glass was intact. She wiped the objective lens with a clean patch of her uniform. She pulled the magazine. 5 rounds of .300 Winchester Magnum. 5 rounds. 4 men. She didn't smile. She just chambered a round. The metallic clack was the only clean sound in the roaring night. Moving was a grueling mathematical equation of pain management. If she put weight on her right leg, the torn muscle screamed and nausea washed over her. If she relied solely on her arms, the ruptured blisters on her palms tore open wider, slicking her hands with blood. She compromised. She used the heavy rifle as a crutch, leaning her weight onto the carbon fiber stock, dragging herself through the dark woods. The secondary extraction point was a defunct logging camp 2 miles south. She knew this because she had planned the initial infiltration route. She had memorized the topography, the sight lines, the exact depression in the eastern ridge that overlooked the camp. It was a 1,000-yard shot from the ridge to the main cabin. It took her 4 hours to cover 1 mile. The rain stopped around 300, replaced by a biting, windless frost. Her wet clothes froze to her skin, stiffening the fabric into icy armor. She had to stop every 20 minutes to scrape the ice off her optic and flex her fingers against her chest to keep the blood flowing. Her thigh was a throbbing, swollen mass. She had wrapped it tight with a torn strip of her own shirt, tied off with paracord, but the makeshift tourniquet was slipping. She could feel a sickening, continuous warmth leaking down her calf into her boot. She reached the ridge just as the sky began to bruise purple in the east. The vantage point was perfect. A slab of granite jutted out from the tree line, offering a commanding, unobstructed view of the valley below. She crawled into the recess beneath a fallen pine, using the dead branches and shadows as natural concealment. She didn't set up immediately. First, she had to stop the shaking. Gillian lay on her back, staring up at the frost-covered pine needles, controlling her breathing. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. She forced her heart rate down. She ignored the burning in her hands, the agonizing pulse in her leg, the deep, biting cold that was seeping into her marrow. She boxed the sensory input up and shoved it into a dark corner of her mind. Survival required machinery, not humanity. She rolled onto her stomach. The granite was freezing against her chest. She deployed the bipod. The legs snapped into place with a crisp finality. She settled the buttstock into the pocket of her shoulder. She looked through the glass. The logging camp lay below, nestled in a bowl of dead pines. The main cabin was a single-story structure with a sagging tin roof. A rusted diesel generator sat out front. Boyd's SUV was parked alongside it, the engine cold. Through the optic, The world was sharp, magnified, and indifferent. She saw the thin trail of smoke rising from the cabin's chimney. They had built a fire. They were warm. They were probably sleeping, assuming the local authorities would write off the safe house blaze as an electrical fault. Gillian adjusted the parallax dial, bringing the cabin door into razor-sharp focus. She dialed in the elevation. Range, 1,050 yards. Wind, negligible, maybe a slight 2-mile-per-hour drift from the left, barely enough to register on the branches. The temperature drop would affect the air density, meaning the bullet would experience slightly more drag. She clicked the elevation turret twice more to compensate. She didn't feel hatred. Hatred required energy, and her reserves were empty. She felt a profound, hollow exhaustion. The men in that cabin were just problems on a math test, variables that needed to be zeroed out. At 05:45, the heavy wooden cabin door swung open. Davies stepped out. He was wearing his tactical pants and a thick grey fleece jacket, rubbing the back of his neck. He walked to the edge of the porch, unzipped his fly, and started to relieve himself into the snow. He looked bored. He looked comfortable. Gillian's breathing slowed to a crawl. She pressed her cheek against the cold stock. The crosshairs rested on Davies' centre mass. Wait, centre mass was reliable, but they had body armour. They might have kept their plates in. She couldn't afford a wounded target scurrying back inside to warn the others. At this distance, a wounded man meant a lost element of surprise, and she was in no physical condition for a prolonged firefight. She shifted the crosshairs up. The intersection settled on the bridge of Davies' nose. At 1,000 yards, the bullet would take time to travel, and gravity would pull it down. She had dialed for the drop, but she still needed him perfectly still. She watched his chest rise and fall. She watched the plume of his breath in the freezing air. She waited for the pause between breaths, that microsecond of absolute stillness where the human body is entirely at rest. Her finger squeezed the trigger. It wasn't a pull. It was a gradual, steady increase of pressure until the sear broke, surprising her. The Mark 13 roared. The recoil punched backward into her bruised shoulder, a solid, grounding impact that sent a fresh wave of pain through her ribs. Through the scope, the violent physics of the .300 Win Mag played out in absolute silence. It took just over a second for the heavy bullet to cross the valley. Davies never heard the shot. His head snapped back in a sudden spray of red and grey mist. His body didn't fall gracefully. It collapsed straight down, a puppet with its strings severed, crumbling onto the snowy porch. The sharp crack of the rifle finally echoed through the valley, rolling like thunder over the tree line. Gillian didn't blink. She worked the bolt. The spent brass ejected, spinning through the frigid air, landing silently in the pine needles. She pushed the bolt forward, chambering the second round. 4 bullets left. 3 men. Down in the valley, the cabin door burst open again. Rousseau stepped out, his rifle half raised, looking frantically at Davies' crumpled body. He hadn't processed the angle yet. The echo was bouncing off the hills, masking the origin point. He didn't know where the death had come from. Gillian moved the crosshairs to Rousseau's throat. The sun breached the horizon, spilling cold, pale light across the valley. It was going to be a beautiful morning. Rousseau froze. The human brain is a pattern recognition machine, and for 2 agonizing seconds, Rousseau's brain could not process the pattern of Davies collapsing into a lifeless heap of ruined fleece and bone. There had been no muzzle flash. There was no enemy in the yard. Then the sound wave hit. The delayed, rolling boom of the .300 Winchester Magnum washed over the valley. Rousseau's survival instincts finally kicked in, but they were sloppy. Instead of dropping flat, He crouched, his boots slipping on the slick, blood-spattered wood of the porch. He swung his short-barreled rifle toward the tree line, scanning wildly, presenting a broad, panicked target. He was looking for movement at 200 yards, completely ignorant of the geometry of his own death. On the ridge, Gillian didn't hold her breath. Holding your breath causes muscle tremors. She exhaled, a long, controlled stream of white vapor that vanished into the freezing air. She let the natural respiratory pause settle her chest. The crosshairs floated over Rousseau's throat. He was yelling something. She could see his jaw working furiously, spit flying from his lips. Her blistered index finger, slick with the serum leaking from her own torn skin, compressed the trigger. Crack! The recoil slammed into her bruised sternum. She tasted a fresh wave of copper as she bit down on the inside of her cheek to keep from screaming. Through the scope, the violence was instantaneous. The heavy round struck Rousseau directly under the chin. The kinetic energy lifted him off his feet, flipping him backward over the porch railing. He landed in the frozen mud with a heavy, wet thud that she couldn't hear but could clearly imagine. 2 down, 2 inside, Gillian worked the bolt. The metallic scrape of the action sounded deafening in the quiet woods. A hot brass casing tumbled onto the frost, melting a small, perfect crescent into the white rim of a pine cone. She pushed the 3rd round into the chamber. The bolt locked down. Suddenly, her vision swam. A dark, fuzzy ring encroached on the edges of her sight. Her right leg was entirely numb below the knee, but her thigh felt like it was packed with crushed glass. The makeshift tourniquet was failing. The fabric was saturated, the cold air turning the blood into a dark, sticky paste against her pants. She had to tighten it. She took her hand off the pistol grip. The cold instantly bit into her exposed, ruined palm. She fumbled in the dirt, her fingers clumsy and thick, until she found a thick piece of deadwood. She slid it under the knot of the paracord and twisted. The friction of the torn muscle grinding against itself was blinding. Gillian slammed her eyes shut. She pressed her forehead against the freezing granite slab, her jaw locking so tight her teeth audibly ground together. She twisted the stick again, cutting off the arterial flow, then shoved the end of the branch under her belt to lock it in place. She lay there for a full minute, her chest heaving, waiting for the nausea to pass. Down in the valley, the cabin was dead silent. Boyd and Miller were professionals. They knew exactly what was happening now. They had calculated the time delay between the impact and the sound. They knew she was elevated, and they knew she was a mile away. The thin wooden walls of the cabin were not cover. They were just concealment. The .300 Win Mag would punch through the pine siding like a needle through wet cardboard. They were trapped in a wooden box, and they knew she had the key. Gillian forced her eye back to the optic. The sun was fully cresting the eastern ridge now, casting long, harsh shadows across the snow. The glare was blinding. She had to use her left hand to cup the objective lens, shielding it from the direct light. A shadow shifted behind the dirty glass of the cabin's front window. It was a stupid mistake, born of panic. Miller was trying to find her optic glare. He was creeping along the floorboards, raising his head just enough to peek over the sill. Gillian saw the pale outline of his face, distorted by the grime on the window pane. She didn't have a clean center mass shot, and the glass would slightly deflect the bullet's trajectory. She adjusted her aim 3 inches to the left of his skull, compensating for the refraction. Her body betrayed her. As she applied pressure to the trigger, a violent shiver racked her spine. The core temperature drop was critical. Hypothermia was hijacking her nervous system. The rifle fired. She knew it was a bad shot the millisecond the sear broke. The crosshairs had jerked low and right. The bullet shattered the window, blowing a spiderweb of jagged glass into the cabin. A muffled, agonizing scream echoed across the valley. Miller didn't drop out of sight. He fell backward, clutching his right shoulder. The round hadn't killed him. It had shattered his clavicle and likely severed the subclavian artery, but it wasn't a clean kill. Gillian cursed, a raspy, breathless sound. She racked the bolt. 2 bullets left. 2 men. And she was freezing to death on a rock. The dynamic had shifted. The psychological terror of the sniper relies on inevitability. By missing the fatal shot, Gillian had shown them a fracture in her perfection. Inside the cabin, the screaming continued. High, wet, and frantic. Miller was bleeding out. Gillian kept the crosshairs trained on the broken window, waiting for Boyd to expose himself to drag Miller to safety. Boyd didn't move. 10 minutes passed. The screaming dissolved into a pathetic, wet gurgling, and then, slowly, into total silence. Boyd had let him die. He hadn't risked a millimeter of exposure to save his contractor. Gillian's respect for Boyd's ruthless pragmatism was matched only by her own fading consciousness. The cold was a physical weight pressing her into the stone. Her breathing was shallow. The edges of her vision were permanently shadowed now. The pain in her ribs had dulled to a distant ache, replaced by a terrifying heavy warmth spreading through her chest. The terminal stages of hypothermia telling her body it was time to go to sleep. "Stay awake," she commanded herself, biting her busted lip until fresh blood flooded her mouth. The sharp metallic taste spiked her adrenaline just enough to keep her eyes focused. Boyd was calculating his odds. He couldn't stay in the cabin forever. The cold would eventually force him out, or she would just systematically dismantle the walls with high-caliber armor-piercing rounds until she hit meat. His only chance was the SUV parked beside the generator. It was 20 feet from the cabin door. If he could cover that distance and get the engine block between himself and the ridge, he could use the vehicle to break her line of sight and escape down the logging road. At 6:30, the cabin's side door, the one facing away from the direct line of the ridge, kicked open. Boyd didn't run. He moved with explosive, calculated speed. He kept his body low, throwing a smoke grenade onto the snow before sprinting toward the front of the SUV. The thick white smoke immediately blossomed, obscuring the front porch and the hood of the vehicle. Gillian didn't panic. Smoke was a visual barrier, but it didn't change the physical layout of the yard. She knew exactly where the driver's side door was. She tracked the crosshairs to the edge of the smoke cloud, anticipating his movement. He had to open the door. He had to sit in the driver's seat. Through the white haze, she saw the heavy steel door of the SUV swing open. She fired. The bullet tore through the smoke and slammed into the heavy steel frame of the SUV's A-pillar with a shower of orange sparks. She had misjudged his speed by a fraction of a second. Boyd scrambled into the cab, slamming the door shut. 1 bullet left. Gillian's hands were shaking so violently she could barely operate the bolt action. She forced it back, ejecting the smoking brass, and shoved it forward, chambering her final round. The SUV's engine roared to life, a deep, guttural diesel growl that vibrated through the crisp morning air. The tires spun in the frozen mud, throwing slush and dirt backward as the heavy vehicle lurched forward. Boyd wasn't trying to reverse. He was driving straight forward, aiming to put the rusted bulk of the diesel generator between the car and the ridge. Gillian tracked the moving vehicle. It was a terrible angle. The windshield was sloped, designed to deflect debris, and it was thick. She had one shot, her body was shutting down, and her target was accelerating behind a wall of moving glass. She didn't aim for Boyd. She aimed for the fatal flaw in the vehicle's geometry. As the SUV cleared the smoke, lunging toward the generator. Gillian placed the crosshairs directly on the center of the steering wheel, right where Boyd's chest had to be pinned against the seat. She stopped fighting the shivers. She embraced the cold, letting it stiffen her muscles, turning her entire body into a rigid, frozen extension of the rifle stock. She squeezed. The Mark 13 unleashed its final breath. The bullet struck the sloped windshield. At 1,000 yards, the heavy round still carried the kinetic energy of a sledgehammer. It didn't deflect. It punched a fist-sized hole through the reinforced glass, instantly filling the cab with a blizzard of silica dust. Through the optic, Gillian watched the chaotic aftermath. The SUV didn't stop immediately. Boyd's foot must have pinned the accelerator in his death throes. The heavy vehicle veered violently to the left, tires screaming against the frozen dirt, and slammed head-on into the massive, cast-iron bulk of the diesel generator. The impact crushed the front grille inward. The hood buckled, snapping off its hinges, and a massive cloud of grey steam erupted from the ruptured radiator, hissing violently into the cold air. The horn began to blare, a continuous, deafening, monotonous drone echoing off the dead trees. Boyd's slumped body was pressing against the steering wheel. Gillian lay perfectly still. She watched the steam billow. She watched the oil pool darkly on the white snow beneath the crumpled engine block. She watched for a full 5 minutes, waiting for a door to open, for a wounded man to crawl out of the wreckage. Nothing moved, only the steam. She slowly, agonizingly, pulled her eye away from the scope. The world without magnification was blurry and vast. The logging camp looked like a child's toy set, ruined and smoking at the bottom of a porcelain bowl. She didn't feel a sense of triumph. There was no closure. The men who had left her to burn were dead, but her skin was still fused to her uniform. Her leg was still dead. She was still stranded on a freezing ridge, miles from anywhere. Gillian let her cheek rest against the freezing granite. She unclipped a small, heavy plastic square from her tactical belt, an encrypted emergency transponder. She hadn't dared activate it earlier, knowing Boyd would have intercepted the localized signal and hunted her down. Now there was no one left to hunt her. She pressed her bloody, blistered thumb against the activation switch. A tiny, silent green LED flared to life in the shadow of the pine tree, transmitting a silent scream up to a satellite orbiting in the cold black of space. She closed her eyes. The copper taste faded, replaced by the clean, numb smell of the snow. She didn't know how long it would take the extraction team to find her. She didn't know if she would be awake when they did. She just knew that she had balanced the ledger, and now she was finally allowed to rest. Did Gillian's brutal, calculated survival leave you breathless? The cold math of a sniper's revenge is never pretty, but her endurance against impossible odds is what makes her a true warrior. If you felt every frozen breath and every pull of the trigger, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next intense, gritty military drama. Drop a comment below. Did Boyd deserve his fate in the wreckage? Share with a friend who loves relentless tactical thrillers.